Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 2021 Governor Summit on Early Language and Literacy. This session is on Literacy Mentoring for Leadership Program, the Impact Study Key Findings. So I am Katrina Davis, the Program Assistant at the Deal Center, and I will be assisting our presenters for today's session. Just a few housekeeping items to keep in mind before we get started. We encourage you to use the chat box to ask questions or share comments. We will hold questions for the presenters until the end of the session for discussion during the question and answer session. Our participant handouts for this presentation are available in the auditorium below the access link in session description. Also, please use the drop-down menu in the chat box to direct all technical questions to me, and I will respond as quickly as possible. And lastly, this presentation is being recorded, so please remain muted throughout the session. So it is my pleasure to introduce our presenters today, Dr. Theresa Magpuri-Lavell, Dr. Grant Smith, and Mr. Garrett Cook. Dr. Magpuri-Lavell is the Executive Director of the Deal Center for Early Language and Literacy. Her research interests are framed around literacy issues, particularly those concerning early literacy skills for kindergarten through third grade students and urban adolescents, with a specific focus on oral reading fluency and building teacher capacity on evidence-based reading instruction. Dr. Smith is the chair of doctoral programs and associate professor of research design and statistics at Bellarmine University. His research interests include accountability measurements and the relationship of educational outcomes and economic opportunity. And Mr. Cook is the Data Analyst 1 at the Deal Center for Early Language and Literacy. In this capacity, he works closely with Dr. Magpuri-Lavell to carry out the research goals of the center and serves as coordinator for the Empowering Communities Through Collective Impact grant. At this time, I'm going to welcome our presenters.
Thank you, Katrina. And good morning, everyone. And on behalf of myself and the co-presenters and the Deal Center team, thank you for joining us for this presentation, where we're going to be presenting today key findings from the Literacy Mentoring for Leadership program. But before we dive into the study context, results, and findings, I would like to situate this research study in the broader context of the work of the Deal Center. Because our children deserve better, the vision of the Deal Center is propelling every Georgia child to read proficiently and beyond. Our mission is to improve the early language and literacy skills of Georgia's children by providing research-based professional development for organizations working with children from birth to age 8. The Deal Center was established in 2017 by the Governor's Office and Legislature with a statewide mission to improve Georgia's literacy rate. During former Governor Deal's 2018 State of the State address, he described the Deal Center as a training and research center that focuses on children birth to third grade, perhaps the most critical period of any child's development and education. To accomplish our vision of propelling every Georgia child to read proficiently and beyond, our approach entails collecting empirical evidence for the Deal Center's quality improvement process for early language and literacy development, research-based professional learning for the birth through age 8 workforce, and early language and literacy grants to support the communities of Georgia. As the Deal Center continues to grow, our team is proud to share these and other ways in which we are laying the foundation to improve our state's early literacy outcomes. Additionally, we know that this work takes collective impact. Therefore, the Deal Center partners with early childhood education programs, K-3 education, universities, technical colleges, and other public and private stakeholders to increase literacy rates and engage the community at large in this very important goal of improving Georgia's literacy rates by the end of third grade. So we are on a quest to embed evidence-based practices for early language and literacy development in organizations working with children birth to age 8. so that we can create a fully transformed system to put all children on the path to reading success. So the development of our professional development model for capacity building, such as the Literacy Mentoring for Leadership program, is based on this research-based PD protocol that you see here. Namely, what the Deal Center is positing is that there is a need to change current practices and, most importantly, ensure that the practices being utilized have been demonstrated with empirical evidence to be efficacious in the environment in order to improve the literacy skills of every Georgia child. So in order to obtain this goal, what we are positing and studying and gathering empirical evidence on is the adults working with children need to be knowledgeable. And what do they need to be knowledgeable of or about? They need to know the theoretical processes and the background knowledge that propels or creates the environment for the development of early language and literacy. And then with that background knowledge, our adults need to know how to translate this knowledge into instructional practice and ultimately believe that he or she is capable and confident to implement these practices. So our professional development model for capacity building is focused on embedding evidence-based, evidence-informed practices for early language and literacy development. The research component of our work here at the Deal Center is to study this protocol by collecting empirical evidence for embedding a new practice and ultimately its impact on early language and literacy development in children birth to age 8. So we have begun this work through the Language and Literacy Mentoring for Leadership program. And now what I'm going to do is turn this over to Dr. Grant Smith to further explain the purpose and of this study. Thank you, Grant.
Thank you, Theresa. Good morning, everyone. I'm Grant Smith. It's a pleasure to be here with you this morning, and thank you for attending our session. So as Theresa indicated, the Deal Center is a far-reaching organization with activities that include partnering, sponsoring, as well as engaging in primary research initiatives that are associated with programs that are completely organic to the Deal Center. One such program, as she mentioned, is the Literacy Mentoring for Leadership program. And today we would like to share some of the results of that program. And in saying that, I want to ground you all in the idea that this is one of several programs that the Deal Center is engaged in, and we are sharing one component of this program. There are multiple components associated with the Literacy Mentoring for Leadership program, but specifically, we're looking at summarizing one goal associated with this particular program, and that is the impact the program has had on the participating teachers' level of knowledge associated with literacy theory and practices, as well as their perceived self-interest and interest in teaching reading. So the specific details associated with this program that I would like to share with you are grounded in a few questions. In a moment or two, Garrett's going to share with you the specific details regarding the implementation and the theoretical underpinnings of the program. I want to share with you on the next slide here, Garrett, the specific information associated with the questions that our research initiative is investigating and summarizing today. And one of the objectives of the LPM program was to increase the knowledge of participating teachers as well as their sense of self-efficacy through various professional development activities that Garrett will share with you. What we want to ask in this research is, how did participating in the program affect teachers' literacy knowledge? Also, how did it impact their sense of self-efficacy and interest in teaching reading? As an associated question that we will engage with every research practice that the Deal Center is involved in, is because of the frameworks that we follow, which I'll share with you shortly. We are always interested in understanding the variability in outcomes and the variability in processes that we're engaged in. So a second objective associated with our research initiative that we'll be targeting and discussing with you today is to understand the depth of knowledge, the degree of mastery, in other words, that the participating teachers have on the language and literacy knowledge assessment test, as well as the degree of variability. In other words, how much differences are there in the depth of content among the various teachers. So those are the two objectives, the research objectives and the associated questions that we will be discussing today. The frameworks that we follow will lead us to a summary of this question. So just kind of a preliminary look on what we're going to share with you today. And this is just kind of to prepare you for what we're going to share with you that we learned. Is the initial question regarding the level of knowledge in literacy as well as the perceived self-efficacy. What we see in our results is that we did see significant growth among participating kindergarten through third grade teachers in both their level of knowledge as well as their perceived self-efficacy. So in the first year with the first cohort, which was the 2018-19 school year, we saw statistically significant increases in both their level of knowledge as well as their reported self-efficacy in teaching reading. Unfortunately, that was followed by a significant decline, which we'll share with you the following year, but there are a number of reasons that may potentially explain that decline. The primary reason that we'll point to is the interruptions that were caused to the delivery of the program associated with the pandemic. And what we follow that with is our most recent measure of the knowledge of the participating teachers. And we get some reaffirmation of the level of mastery that the teachers have based on the replication of this subsequent measure in the fall of 2020. So what we're going to see here is an increase in knowledge followed by a subsequent decline among the teachers that we sampled, which may be attributable to the strange circumstances that we've all been through. But what we do see is throughout all of the replicated measures is a consistency in terms of two areas. One is, what is the level of mastery among teachers? And we're going to share that with you. And two, how much variability is there in the content knowledge from teacher to teacher? And we'll share that with you. I want to share two more slides with you that essentially provide you with some insight into how we approach research at the Deal Center and why the investigation of the variability in knowledge is important. The first is this idea of improvement science. And improvement science is, again, the disciplined use of evidence-based research practices to investigate the process and the associated outcomes. A couple of things that designate improvement science as a framework that make it a little bit unique from some other approaches. First of all, as Theresa alluded to, we focus almost exclusively on the use of empirical evidence to make our decisions. So we're truly a data-driven organization, and the data that we rely on is empirical data that we collect through the use of rigorous research methods. And we call this the structured inquiry or scientific framework approach to evaluating processes. So that's the first, is an emphasis on data that is derived through rigorous quantitative and qualitative methods. The second element that kind of sets aside improvement sciences is this idea of statistical thinking. And what we're looking here is, first of all, we take a process view. And we believe that any outcome we study is the result of a process, which is a series of interrelated steps. And we believe the key to improving the outcome is to focus on the process. Rather than focusing exclusively on the outcome, we look at the steps in the process in an effort to improve that. And the variability in the outcome is explained by the variability in the process. And that's the improvement science framework. Within the improvement science framework, we adhere to some implementation science practices. Implementation science is essentially a specific investigation on the use of evidence-based practices, following the same rules, and that is that we rely on scientific structured inquiry as a means of investigating our question. Our question here within the implementation science framework is, what are the barriers and the facilitators to the adoption and implementation of evidence-based practices? So the frameworks that we're relying on to investigate our research questions, again, as a reminder, is how much do teachers learn? How strong do teachers feel in terms of their self-efficacy in teaching literacy? And then how much do they know and how much variability is in that? It's important from a improvement sciences perspective, and from an implementation science perspective, we want to focus on what facilitates and what impedes the use of evidence-based practices. So with those frameworks in mind, I'm going to turn it over to Garrett, who will share some of the theoretical foundations of our work and ultimately the results. So there you go, Garrett.
Thanks, Grant and Theresa, for kicking us off. As mentioned earlier, my name is Garrett Cook. I'm a data analyst at the Deal Center, and I'm going to be walking you all through the nuts and bolts of our study and reviewing some of the key findings. So the aim of the LMLP is to raise student outcomes in reading by increasing educator knowledge of the science of reading and improving classroom practice among K through third grade teachers. With this in mind, implementation of the LMLP is supported by the theory of action laid out on your screen. We begin by providing instructional practice with coaching support to increase teacher knowledge of the theory and research behind early language and literacy instruction. This instructional practice is then bolstered by a hierarchy of leadership instructional support, beginning at the Deal Center level and working down to the school level. I will go into greater detail about this support system hierarchy in a few slides. Once these instructional practices are strengthened and implementation has begun, we administer formative assessments to inform us of the teacher's progress as well as the fidelity of the implementation. By ensuring a continuous system of support, providing instruction on the theory and research, and systematically evaluating teacher progress and implementation fidelity through formative assessments, we are able to improve teacher instructional capacity, which we theorize would then raise student achievement. So, our theory of action is grounded in the idea across the bottom of this slide. If we build a more knowledgeable teacher while simultaneously ensuring high quality practices, it will eventually lead to improved student outcomes. The LMLP is also grounded in Vygotsky's social learning theory, which utilizes the concept known as scaffolding. Scaffolding employs the use of what's known as the more knowledgeable other, which can be simply defined as an instructor who has a better understanding of the subject matter than their student. Social learning theory also utilizes a concept called the zone of proximal development, which is the space between what a learner can do with assistance and what a learner can do without assistance. Essentially, support is provided by the more knowledgeable other to the extent that it is needed. Support is then reduced and eventually removed as the learner becomes increasingly competent. The end result is a transfer of responsibility for successful performance from the support provider to the learner. So just like scaffolding in construction, supports are used to the extent that they are needed and are removed as competency grows. Here we have an overview of the support system hierarchy that's embedded in the LMLP from year 1 to year 2. At the highest level, Deal Center Language and Literacy Mentors, also known as LLMs, were assigned to support school-based literacy teams and work directly with literacy coaches. Literacy coaches were also assigned to support K through third grade teachers at each school through professional learning and coaching support. The school-based literacy teams were made up of the school's administrative staff, a literacy coach, and 1 teacher leader per grade level from K to 3rd grade. The box at the bottom of the middle column provides an overview of the monthly duties of any given LLM. Mentors were each assigned to support 3 schools, and they spent 3 weeks per month in schools delivering training and supporting classroom instruction. During the 4th week of each month, the LLMs participated in ongoing instructional workshops with the school-based literacy team. In year 1 of the program, these instructional workshops were administered directly by the Deal Center. However, year 2 involved a strategic program modification in which the instructional workshops were transitioned to school-based delivery. This transition is consistent with Vygotsky's social learning theory, as the transition from center-based professional development to school-based professional development was intended to close the zone of proximal development and transfer the responsibility of success from the center to the schools. So, to give an overview of the process, year 1 school-based literacy teams and mentors participated in monthly instructional workshops to be trained and subsequently redeliver the information at the school level. In year 2, administration of monthly instructional workshops was transitioned to the school level to close the zone of proximal development. Redelivery of the instructional workshops was implemented at the school level by literacy coach and the teacher leaders. Classroom instruction was then monitored and supported by the literacy coach and LLM to ensure high implementation fidelity. Participants in the first cohort of the LMLP, which as Grant mentioned was during the 2018 to 2019 school year, included 5 LLMs and 14 schools across 5 districts. There were a total of 238 K through 3rd grade classrooms at the beginning of the study. The subject matter of our program focused on building the theoretical knowledge on early language and literacy, implementing the practice of word study using Gansky's word journeys, utilizing a guided reading approach for small group differentiated instruction, administering formative reading assessments for the purposes of differentiated instruction, and employing instructional strategies for reading fluency development. Now, the assessment tool that we use to measure teachers' level of literacy knowledge is known as the Language and Literacy Knowledge Assessment, also known as the LLKA. The LLKA is a rigorous assessment comprised of 81 multiple choice questions across 4 distinct domains: language, decoding, comprehension, and assessment. The right 2 columns on this chart reflect the reliability ratings of the LLKA. Reliability was measured using the Kuder-Richardson 20 or KR20 scale and the Gutman Reliability Scale. With both of these scales, an acceptable level of reliability is 0.7, which gives evidence that 3 of the 4 domains, and most importantly, the total of the entire LLKA, can be administered with sufficient reliability. In addition to the LLKA, a self-efficacy assessment was administered to assess teachers' interest and confidence in language and literacy instruction. This self-report assessment utilizes a 5-point Likert scale across 20 items in 2 domains. Cronbach's alpha was used to measure the reliability of this assessment, yielding exceptionally high reliability ratings for each of the domains and the assessment as a whole, which you can see on the right column. Before going into the results of our study, I'm going to go over our limitations. First, our power was reduced because we utilized independent groups in our sampling rather than a matched pairs design. We felt that preserving the anonymity of our teachers had to be prioritized in order to ensure higher compliance. Additionally, response rates varied between subsequent administrations of our assessment. Of the initial 238 classrooms, non-response rates ranged from 35 to 62%. So we had some schools that were very compliant and others who were very low in compliance. One of the original designs of the LMLP, as I mentioned, was to strategically transition to site-based PD development in year 2. This sort of transition, as I said, is consistent with Vygotsky's social learning theory, which was part of our framework. By transitioning to site-based PD, we were removing a piece of the scaffolding, transferring the responsibility to the schools and closing the zone of proximal development. Unfortunately, however, this does pose a limitation from a research standpoint because it was a change in delivery of our program from year 1 to year 2. And finally, year 2 PD delivery was ultimately hindered by the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. Now I'm going to take us through the results of our study. Since we took a two-pronged approach to our research questions, studying both the impact of the program on teachers' literacy knowledge and the impact on their self-efficacy and interests, I'm going to review each domain's results independently. So first, we will have a look at how the LMLP impacted teachers' literacy knowledge. The chart on your screen reflects the results of the LLKA for the 2018 to 2019 cohort. This iteration of the LMLP was unhindered by the impacts of COVID and is subsequently our most reliable representation of the impact of full program implementation. Notably, the average scores on the LLKA had a relative increase of 17%, which represents a statistically significant increase as a result of the LMLP intervention. Perhaps most shocking, though, is the wide range of variability in teachers' scores on this assessment. With score ranges from 18 to 88% in fall of 2018 and 29 to 89% in spring of 2019, this data begs the question, what is causing such a wide range of literacy knowledge among early childhood educators? To give you an idea of questions from the LLKA, here are a few of the least difficult items. One example of an easier question is how many syllables are in the word nationality? Between 93 and 98% of the 2018 to 2019 cohort got these 3 questions correct. And here are a few examples of the most difficult items. One example of a tougher question is how many phonemes are in the word explain? Between 5 and 12% of the 2018 to 2019 cohort got these 3 questions correct when they first took the LLKA. By spring 2019, there was a slight increase in accuracy on these items, with between 10 and 20% of teachers answering correctly. Now, when you break the results of the LLK down into each of their domains, you can see increases of about 7.5 to 10% for language, decoding, and comprehension from fall 2018 to spring 2019. We excluded the results of the final domain, assessment, due to its low reliability. However, it is notable that this domain also followed the same positive trend as the other 3 domains. Now, we will review the impact of the LMLP on teachers' self-efficacy and interest in literacy instruction. The chart on the left gives an example of 11 of the items on the self-efficacy assessment. On a Likert scale, teachers were asked to rate their self-efficacy and interest in items such as meet the needs of your struggling readers and teach students to figure out unknown words when reading. There were significant increases in 11 of the 20 items on the self-efficacy and interest assessment, and although the effect size for any given item is small, the number of significant gains is noteworthy. Our data reflects significant increases from fall 2018 to spring 2019 in both the self-efficacy domain and the total survey. While the increase in interest scores was not statistically significant, this may be partly due to the relatively high level of interest recorded in fall 2018 when teachers first took the assessment. That said, the trend in interest scores is similar to that of efficacy and the total survey. Here are some key findings from our study. First, teachers' knowledge and self-efficacy increased significantly during the LMLP. Additionally, we observed a relatively modest effect size with a net increase of 9% from fall 2018 to spring 2019 and a relative increase of 17%. Although the effect size is not substantial, it should be noted that any positive, statistically significant effect is worthy of consideration given the historical challenges faced with improving educational outcomes. Next, although self-reported interest levels did not increase significantly, it is important to mention that initial levels of interest were noticeably higher than self-efficacy at the start. And finally, as Grant mentioned earlier, in subsequent administrations of the LLKA, the 2019 to 2020 and 2020 to 2021 cohorts replicated the mastery and variability levels found in the first year of the LMLP. Because we found such variable levels of mastery on the LLKA, we're going to dig a bit deeper into this data before we move on to our conclusions and implications. The chart on your screen shows the average scores across each administration of the LLKA. The fall 2018 and spring 2019 administrations were largely made up of the same teachers, which is yet another reason that this cohort is our most indicative gauge of the impact of our program. As mentioned earlier, scores in this cohort increased significantly from an average of 52.5% in fall of 2018 to 61.4% in spring of 2019. For a few reasons, the spring 2020 cohort represents an abnormal group for the LMLP. First, this is when the strategic modification of site-based PD delivery took place. In addition to that, the sample of teachers in spring 2020 included new teachers who had not yet participated in the LMLP. And finally, this set of data was collected during the chaotic onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. For these reasons, we believe it is reasonable to, at least in part, attribute this especially low average to extraneous circumstances. The fall 2020 iteration of the LLKA represents a sample of entirely new teachers. If you will notice, the fall 2020 average score of 55.7% is similar to the fall 2018 average score of 52.5%, which indicates similar levels of baseline mastery for teachers who have not yet experienced the LMLP intervention. Across the 4 administrations of the LLKA from fall 2018 to fall 2020, the average mastery levels ranged from 49 to 61%. Perhaps more concerning, though, is the level of variability within each given measurement period. If you will turn your attention to the box and whisker plot to the right of this slide, you will notice high levels of variability between the first and fourth quartile of each administration of the LLKA, with low scores below 30% and high scores above 85%. We believe this variability is cause for a considerable amount of concern because there is very little consistency with teachers' literacy content knowledge. Some early childhood educators are operating with average to high levels of content knowledge, where others display extremely low levels of content knowledge. In review, our key findings in regards to variability of teachers' content knowledge are as follows. Overall average mastery of the LLKA remains low, with the highest recorded average of 61% in spring of 2019. Next, the variability of teachers' performance on the LLKA remains high, with an approximate range of 29 to 89%. And finally, subsequent administrations of the LLKA from 2019 to 2020 replicated both the mastery and variability levels found in the first measures. Perhaps the biggest takeaway from our findings: why is there such a huge difference in the knowledge of early language and literacy instructors? So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Grant to take you through our conclusions and our implications.
Thanks, Garrett. That was a lot of information summarized for us, and we're grateful for that. So just a review of what we're concluding based upon the preliminary work we've done in measuring teachers' knowledge. First of all, the impact of the mentoring program appeared to be associated with a significant increase in self-efficacy as well as knowledge. So that's a positive outcome. So we want to conclude that the mentoring program is again associated. We can't directly infer causation, but we can say it's associated with an increase. Now, despite the increase, if we look at the overall levels of mastery, they remain relatively low. And by relatively low, what we're saying is that on average, they're getting about half of these items correct. So 1 out of 2, approximately, 50 to 60% of the items are they answering correctly. So we see an increase, but we also see persistent low levels of mastery. And these low levels are replicated in subsequent measures. So what we've got now is an measurement instrument, the LLKA, which has a history of producing reliable indicators of teachers' knowledge and literacy. We see that we saw an increase following the mentoring program, but despite this increase, we see consistently low levels of knowledge, about, again, 50 to 60% mastery. Equally as alarming, what we saw within the teachers is a wide range of variability. So you may walk into a classroom where a teacher has 80 to 85% mastery of the constructs that are included on the LLKA, or you may walk into a classroom where a teacher has 20% mastery of those same constructs. So these conclusions have certain implications and what we should be thinking about from a next step perspective. Given this wide range of variability, the first thing we need to think about from an improvement sciences perspective is that before we can work on improving the outcome, which in this case is student reading, we need to work back upstream. And if we believe that teachers' knowledge is a critical factor in determining student outcomes in reading achievement, we need to prioritize investigating the sources of the variability that are causing this variability in teacher knowledge. So from an improvement sciences perspective, this is a very classic approach to process improvement. And that is when we see a great deal of variability among the participants in a process, we would conclude that this could be one of the primary explanatory variables that explain the variability in student outcomes. Very simply stated, if the teachers have a wide range of knowledge, it's logical to assume that the students will have a wide range of achievement based upon which teacher that they've been exposed to. So the next steps for this is investigating this variability. So if we assume that our theory of action is correct, and we want to go to the next slide there, Garrett. If we assume, good, the theory of action supporting the LMLP begins with building teacher knowledge in literacy, both the research, the theory, and the strategies. And if we believe that the building a better teacher, so to speak, produces better student outcomes, then the implications associated with our findings are such. These extreme ranges in the variability in teacher knowledge indicates that the greatest opportunity for improvement in student outcome lies in investigating and identifying the causes of this teacher variability, and then introducing potential interventions that would reduce that variability. So from this perspective of process improvement science, we would conclude that one of the principal explanatory factors in why students are reading at different levels is because teachers have different levels of knowledge. And the critical question is, what's causing this variability in knowledge? So the first step in improving this process, based upon the results of this research, is to identify the root causes that explain the variability in teacher knowledge. And that is the greatest opportunity and the most important finding that we concluded based upon 2.5 years of data collection and replications utilizing a very reliable instrument, that there's a huge range in teachers' knowledge of literacy theory, practices, and the research supporting it. So our greatest opportunity that we conclude lies in identifying this variability, investigating the root causes, and then potentially developing interventions that can reduce it. So I thank you again for participating, and I'll ask Theresa to close our presentation with some comments.
Thank you, Grant, and thank you, Garrett. As we at the Deal Center try to create this fully transformed system of early language and literacy development across the birth to age 8 continuum, what we are doing at the Deal Center, using our approach of research, gathering empirical evidence to support this improvement process that we're trying to embark on, as well as then disseminating that information through our research-based professional development. But we are following the data, just to summarize what we have heard here today for our work here at the Deal Center. We are going to follow the data. And the interesting story that we have unearthed here is that variability. And what we want to know at the Deal Center as we continue in this work is what is causing that variability, and to think of it perhaps as a root cause to the improvements that are going to be needed in order to develop this system for early language and literacy development. So I thank you for joining us today. I thank you for joining us for the summit in and of itself to work together to advocate for literacy equity for all of Georgia's children. At this time, we will open it up for questions and comments. You can either put them in, if you would put them in the chat, we'll monitor the chat, and Katrina will help us read through them.
Cool. Actually, we have 2 comments at the moment. One of the first questions, do you have any theories on what contributes to the variability in teacher knowledge? And can you share the publication for the study?
So I'll address the publication question, and that is the publication hasn't been submitted yet. So we're just concluding. We have one more round of data collection that we will employ here this summer. And then we will have completed the data collection among those teachers. And at that point, we will compile that information into a publication. In regards to the theories as to contributing to the variability in teacher knowledge, I'm a statistician and not a literacy expert, so I'll share my limited thoughts on this. And that is that from an improvement science perspective, what we would do then is look at teacher knowledge as an outcome. We started this particular research journey ultimately with the idea that teacher knowledge explains student outcomes. And what we found is there's such extensive variability in teacher outcomes that we need to back up in the process. So my response to the theories on what contributes to the variability in teacher knowledge is I don't know. However, we have some ideas on how we would like to investigate that, and we would like to move upstream in this process to determine what is the process by which our teachers acquire literacy knowledge. So Theresa or Garrett, if you have any comments, I'll be quiet.
Mm-hmm. I would say we have hypotheses, right, as to what is contributing to this variability. And again, following the data and analyzing the data before making implications or certain conclusions. But there is variability in training of teachers, which I do believe contributes to obviously this variability in teacher knowledge. I think our field in and of itself is highly variable in terms of what we disseminate in terms of training and professional learning. There is, we're also supported by the body of literature that supports the value that a teacher does play and ultimately student outcomes. So we are also trying to determine what the value of the knowledge of literacy development is within the overall model. So we do have hypotheses, but we want to follow the data. And I think the main takeaway from here is we need to ask that question and determine how best to study that variability.
And we have one other question. You probably touched on this also. Does your data include information about teacher experience and or in-state versus out-of-state degrees?
So I think I probably have the most insight into what the data includes. And at this point, no. However, these are excellent questions, and they point to potential explanatory variables and what may explain some of the variability in teacher knowledge. So the purpose of our data collection was to provide a very non-threatening vehicle by which teachers could respond to what essentially becomes a competency assessment. So as such, we were very, very careful not to collect a lot of the information which we know could be very helpful in explaining this, because we wanted them to answer without fear of being identified in any manner. So it's an excellent question, and I believe level of education, experience, environment they're working in, where they obtain their degree, all of these are really, really great questions and could potentially explain what some of that variability is. But unfortunately, with this particular study, we do not have that data.
And we still have a few more minutes. If there's any other questions at this time, if you want to put them in the chat box. If not, we'll close our session out in just a few minutes. Look, most of our questions are thank you. So at this time, I'm going to go ahead and thank our presenters for this wonderful and informative session. And for everyone out there, please enjoy the rest of this summit. And thank you for joining us today.